Hello, welcome to the 16th episode of Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Kate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This episode is about Boo, a Madea Halloween from 2016. Our next episode, get you ready, is going to be about The Cabin in the Woods from 2012. So before we get started talking about Boo...
We're assuming that you have seen this masterpiece already, and this conversation will unfold with tons of spoilers. So if you don't want to know what happened to Madea when she went up against the evil fraternity in this fine film, pause right now, go watch that great movie, come back and enjoy the conversation on our level.
And I'm going to do the thing that every podcast does that nobody ever listens to, but I feel I'd be remiss if I didn't do it, and ask that you rate and review this fine podcast, Scary Thoughts, on iTunes and Stitcher, but mostly iTunes where it actually counts. It makes a huge difference. And we also loved hearing from you and love having the input. Love to hear what you guys think, what we should do next, what we got wrong, what we got right.
Yeah, and you can go over to Instagram at scarythoughts.podcast and leave your comments there, or you can go check out at Scary Thoughts on Facebook, which is where a lot of the conversation happens with people who listen. There's always something fun going on over there. Do you have anything to plug this week, Mark?
I do, actually. Thank you so much for asking, Chad. I was actually in Los Angeles recently to do a live episode of my other podcast, Why We Listen. I went down and spoke with the artist Nayland Blake. He is based in New York, and courtesy of Volume and ICA and Cooper Union, went down and did a live version, and it was great. It was really magic. One of my favorite things I've ever done, let alone in podcast land, and I'd love for you all to check it out. whywelisten.org. Why We Listen is also on Stitcher and iTunes, and I've had the opportunity to interview some really great people. I haven't really plugged my other podcast on Scary Thoughts as much as I probably should, but I'm super proud of it, and I'm super proud of the people I've gotten to talk to. But this most recent episode live was pretty great.
Yeah, that's a show. I really like that show. I especially like your intros.
Oh, thank you.
On the show. I think they're really well done.
Thank you so much. This one has no intro because it's just a live thing. We just got straight to the meat. But yeah, I love writing the intros to that podcast. And before we really dig into this episode, 2 episodes was Forrest Gump. That was our April Fool's episode. This is not an April Fool's episode. We're actually covering Boo, a Madea Halloween, which I feel like everyone I've ever said, oh, our next episode's about Boo, thought I was joking. Mm-hmm. Which says, I think, a lot about how Tyler Perry is regarded, and maybe a little bit about what a snob I might be perceived as, which I probably am.
Yeah.
But
most of the people I talked to had not even heard of this movie. It's so not on people I know's radar, but still these movies make buckets of money. I mean, this movie grossed $74 million, and it looks like it probably cost about $300 to make.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the new Hollywood model. You know, mobilizing fan bases, making fast, cheap, fun movies that don't cost a whole lot of money. And in some ways, this is just like classic horror.
Absolutely.
Like, low budget, do what you want,
Yep.
Make it for fans, crank it out, move on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the disparity between how something like Tyler Perry movies are regarded, the disparity of the ratings and reviews and how they're directed at Tyler Perry's content versus how much money they make and how well they do at the box office is super fascinating. It really reminds me of, it's actually a book I loaned you, which is, I don't know if our listeners are familiar with the 33 and a Third book series, which is this book series about albums, like every book, one book per album. Mm-hmm. Like one author will take one historical album from a band or an artist and just write one book about it. And someone, this rock critic, wrote a book just about Celine Dion's Let's Talk About Love, the one with the Titanic theme. Mm-hmm. But the book is called Let's Talk About Love, A Journey to the End of Taste. And the premise of the book, if I can encapsulate it quickly, is that the writer and all his snobby music writer friends don't even think about Celine Dion. Like, she's so, like, they'll make jokes about, like, Britney Spears or, you know, really famous pop acts, but not Celine Dion. Like, she's so beneath regard that she's not even on the radar to mock. But she's also one of the most successful, listened to, revered artists in the history of humanity. So he really wanted to question, what is that disparity? What is this thing called taste that he and his music critic friends have that the great unwashed masses do not? And he wanted to understand and get into the skin of people who love Celine Dion and try to understand it from their perspective. It's a really interesting book. I tried to go along and listen to her album and see if I could find an appreciation for her, and I didn't at all. But I did with Tyler Perry. This was my first Tyler Perry movie. He was completely off my radar for sure. I would never even think of it. It always just, you know, I'd see 2 seconds of a preview of a Madea movie and think like, oh, it's, you know, what is it, just going to be some fart jokes and a morality tale? And but because this sort of had a potential horror content, I decided to watch it, and I laughed my ass off. It's so funny.
I was really surprised at how well a lot of the gags and jokes work in this film. I mean, just the character Mabel Madea Simmons is a really hilarious character. I mean, there's just so much going on there. She used to be a hoe, may or may not be a dude. That's a thing that comes up over and over again. You know, carries a gun, drives this old 1970s Cadillac.
Carries a hammer in her purse.
Yeah, carries a hammer, is just ready to dish out violence with the quickness, and just does not give a fuck about any PC concerns. I mean, this movie is like a safe space for non-PC humor. They're making fun of fat kids. They're making fun of pretty much everything. Like, it reminds me in some ways, it's not as good as, but it reminds me of how wide the Chappelle Show could get in its ridicule sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you talk about people maybe not knowing what the 33 1/3 book series were, but I imagine some people might not even know who Tyler Perry is that listen to this podcast.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, this is his 9th film, but it's only the 2nd one that wasn't already based on a play. And where Tyler Perry's really become famous is he would basically do these stage productions that were filmed and made into DVDs and just played at like church functions. There's like a very big like religious undertone and overtone to a lot of these Madea films. Like, Madea is definitely a character that would have emerged out of like the Black church experience. And, you know, in this movie, she talks about being from New Orleans, which I thought was, because I'm from New Orleans. So I was like, oh,
well, Tyler Perry is from New Orleans too. You
Yeah,
you guys are probably neighbors.
Well, I think that was
one
of the things that made me laugh so much about this movie is a lot of what I guess is supposed to be familiar to like the Black experience is also in some ways familiar to the poor Southern experience, just generally. Like, the whole idea of like kids getting beat. I grew up with that. The whole idea of like these weird, you know, church things where you're like, you have like Halloween church night instead of Halloween. Like, that stuff goes on in the South, especially in dry areas.
Okay, so I think something that was fun trying to get ready for this episode is when I realized Tyler Perry had made a Halloween movie, I was kind of excited because I was like, oh, he made a horror movie. That's my territory. What does he have to contribute? And after watching this movie and laughing hysterically, I realized he had nothing to contribute to the genre, because it actually is not a horror film, like, at all. Like, I would not be surprised if he's never seen any actual horror movies in his life.
I mean, this is basically a Scooby-Doo episode.
Yes.
You know, it has
it's less scary than a Scooby-Doo.
Yeah, it's definitely
episode.
I mean, I don't even think there's a single jump scare in this.
There is the clown.
Oh, right, the clown
on Uncle Joe or whatever.
Yeah. But it's funny how like this movie came out before the big revival of interest in scary clown shit. Remember last year there was this whole like rash of people dressing up like clowns and running around.
Well, it started happening in Northampton in England a couple of years ago, but it jumps the pond only recently.
Yeah, but you know, she violates the horror rules a little bit, like, because the clown pops up she punches the clown in the face and just knocks it right out.
Done.
You know, and later on when she's dressed up as the Uncle Joe Simmons, or Tyler Perry is dressed up as the Uncle Joe Simmons character, laying on a couch, super, super high. It's basically kind of like an Uncle Ruckus character from the Boondocks, like very similar, like mean old man with white hair. And, you know, clown pops up, and very similar to in Cabin in the Woods, the weed seems to allow the character to see through the horror.
Right.
And he's like, nah, and just wrecks the clown with the cane. And that's pretty much it for like the scary elements of this movie. And the whole reason why it's even a horror movie is because it just takes place during Halloween. And this really could just be, I mean, it's in the title. It's a Madea Halloween. It's not a Madea horror.
Right.
You know.
But it could easily have been a Madea Easter or a Madea Valentine's Day. It's just a vehicle for the morality tale that's going on underneath.
But okay, so that brings us right to, okay, so why a Madea Halloween movie? And this is one of my favorite details of this entire film's existence is Chris Rock made a movie called Top 5, which was one of his like critical darling movies. Like critics seem to really like that movie. And in the film, there's a throwaway line where he says something like the movie that his character's just made probably won't do nearly as well as Madea chases ghosts. So he basically makes a joke about a non-existent Madea Halloween movie. And Tyler Perry apparently sees this and decides that, hey, we're going to make me and Lionsgate Films are going to make a Madea Halloween movie. And before the next Halloween it was out. I think it took like a month for them to write it, and they shot the whole thing in 6 days. Yeah. And it grossed $74 million. And Chris Rock's movie did like $26 million. So I don't know, man. I was Tyler Perry. Rock. I know, was Chris Rock using The Secret, or was Tyler Perry using The Secret? Because the shit came true.
Well, one thing that made me kind of interested in doing an episode about this, other than just the novelty of the anomaly of it, is to plug in the way we approach horror movies and see what sticks. Like, okay, if we're going to talk about what horror movies normally do and apply it to Madea, the issue of collective dread, the issue of horror movies often being a reflection of some sort of collective cultural anxiety and being an analysis of that. Well, what does Boo, a Madea Halloween, have to say about a collective dread in society? And I don't know about you, but the best I could do is about the wildness of youth.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
In an interview, Tyler Perry actually said it's all about parents getting in control. It's just about putting your foot down and running your household and being the leader of the alpha of your own pack.
Well, I mean, I guess it's an opportunity to talk about the plot a little bit. So what goes on in the movie is there's a girl named Tiffany Simmons, and she's a very attractive young girl. She's 17 years old. She's a high school student. She has 3 friends. 2 of them are not in high school, or at least they're 18. That comes into play a little bit later. So there's 2 17-year-olds, 2 18-year-olds, and they're like a little 4-pack of friends. And they're walking home, and they pass a frat house, which is made up of 40-year-old frat guys. Like, everybody in this fraternity, all the actors are YouTube stars, and which is really an interesting way to market a film, because each one of these actors has 500,000 to 1 million subscribers on YouTube. So you basically know that if those guys bring a certain percentage of their fans, this movie's going to do okay, which is pretty interesting from an economics of film.
And aside from that, I think it's also interesting, and looking at interviews with Tyler Perry himself, about these really young, talented kids who need a break. And Tyler Perry, a lot of his ethos is about reaching out and lending a hand and raising people up. And to him, although what you're saying is true, I think it's also an interesting talent pool to draw from, a very underrepresented and unexploited talent pool to exploit in, it's not a Hollywood film, but in major films.
I would even say that if you listen to like marketing guys like Gary Vaynerchuk, Hollywood is exploiting the popularity of the YouTube stars more than the YouTube stars are like suddenly becoming validated by Hollywood. Because a lot of these guys, they get like film deals or whatever, and they stop doing their YouTube thing, and then their careers collapse. But the really smart guys continue on with their YouTube career, pulling in like $200,000 a month off of like ads. Like the guy PewDiePie. I mean, that guy made $7 million last year screaming into a mic while he played video games. And it's not for me, but it is a cultural phenomenon like Minecraft or something like that.
Yeah.
And, there's something very intelligent. Like, you look at the way Tyler Perry films have been distributed, word of mouth marketing. These films became huge by being shared and talked about in the Black community. And, they're multi-generational in interest. I mean, even that SNL skit where Tom Hanks plays the racist Trump supporter and he's on Black Jeopardy.
Yes.
One of the questions, basically the way the comedy skit went was that it was a Black-oriented Jeopardy questions, and Tom Hanks is a MAGA hat-wearing dude, and he's there. And as they ask them questions, it turns out that like the poor white experience and the poor Black experience is essentially the same. They like the same kind of stuff. And then Madea movies are brought up. And he's like, man, if you can laugh and pray in an hour and a half, then that sounds like money well spent. And there's something about that, like uplifting humor stuff plays everywhere, and I think that might even, it doesn't explain Celine Dion, but it definitely explains the popularity of this movie, is that there are moments in it that are just genuinely funny. Like the character, Aunt Bam, like this like short, totally round, devious pot smoking elderly woman is a hilarious comic character.
She's great.
Yeah, I mean,
with her jack-o'-lanterns that are basically 420, a pot leaf.
I mean, that was the thing, like not being really familiar with these films or not seeing them. I had always heard that they were like churchy and moralistic. So yes. I came in expecting this sort of like Oprah Network level of humor, and you get like a weed scene that's as in depth as, I don't think you ever see anybody smoke pot, but you see joints. Yeah. And like it's basically as hard as Friday is in some ways. Especially, you have this lady who's super high stealing candy from kids' bags. I mean, it's hilarious. And then ripping on these kids like, oh, you don't need this candy. Look at you, your fat ass, and all this stuff. And you're like, whoa, when's the last time you heard like a fat joke in a movie?
Right.
It's here in Madea land.
Actually, just on that, it is Madea Halloween is at the box office ranked number 14 in fat suit comedies.
Oh, is that a genre?
It is where I was digging. It is no box office, not like rated. I'm sorry. It's like as far as grossing.
Huh.
That if you take all the fat suit comedies and you look at their numbers, it's 14, which is such a weird statistic. But if we can back up, you were starting to talk about the frat. You were talking plot, and we
got completely derailed by this whole discussion of YouTube. I'm just fascinated by YouTube economics, so I'm just really into that right now. But yeah, okay. So the girl Tiffany, she walks past this fraternity, and flirtation ensues. And the guys all think that they're college girls or whatever, and they're dressed not inappropriately, but definitely a little more stylish than a high school kid might. And then her father, Brian Simmons, who's a completely emasculated, super nerdy, driving a Volvo V70 station wagon dude, rolls up and is like, hey, what have I told you about walking past this fraternity? And the daughter is completely disobedient. She's just like, fuck you, Dad. I do what I want. And he just has no control over her. So the next few scenes of the film follow her plans to like basically sneak out of the house and go to the frat party later that night, because the frat has these legendary Halloween parties. And then the father just has no control, and so he basically invites his aunt Madea over to kind of regulate for him, and hilarity ensues.
I think something that is really odd when thinking about the plot of this movie is that this movie is almost two movies. I feel like every scene, or every other scene, is almost from a different movie. Mm-hmm. There are scenes with Madea and Hattie and Joe and Bam riffing.
Yep.
And it's hysterically funny. They're
Yeah.
so good. And I don't know how he gets that rhythm when he's playing multiple characters in the same... You know, it's like the best Saturday Night Live sketch, but clearly in multiple takes.
But it's also really shitty because, like, unlike The Nutty Professor, you never see the different characters that Tyler Perry's playing in the same scene. They're not, like, sitting down next to each other. So it's
Sometimes they are.
Are you sure?
In the living room.
Oh, I guess so.
Yeah, Joe and Madea and Joe
yeah, I guess
and
you're right.
the dad. Yeah. But then the other half of the movie, whenever it's just people talking, it's so bad. It's like sub sitcom par level of acting and dialogue. It's really forced. It's really constructed. It's really bizarre, actually. Like at the end, just jumping to the end, when what's Tyler Perry as the dad's name?
Brian
again?
Simmons.
Brian, yeah. When Brian, he's scolding them, he's like, I hope you learned your lesson. I hope all of you learned your lesson. This is just wrong. That's what he wrote? That's the climax of the movie? That's some shitty writing. And it's shocking that that's in the same movie as some of the fucking, like, back and forth that happens between these characters.
Yeah, like all the I guess it's exposition where Medea's talking about, like, when she was a hoe and she was, on the pole and all that. So that shit is, I mean, it's legitimately funny.
Yeah.
And I think, I went around and watched some YouTube videos about people reviewing this movie, and I was really surprised at how many legitimate film critics were like, yeah, this movie, there's so much wrong with it, but when it's funny, it's very funny. I mean, the things that are wrong with it, like, there's continuity errors everywhere.
Yeah.
There's moments where it's dark outside, but when they go outside, the lighting's lighter than when they were in the house. I mean, just everything's just... Like, from a craft perspective, this movie is awful.
Yeah.
There's moments when the camera is pointing directly at one character and it's not in focus.
Yeah.
And, I mean, just real basic film craft stuff that you would... I mean... say what you want about a lot of the modern horror movies being super shitty. A lot of them look great.
Yes, that is a big feather in the cap of the genre of horror films, is that so many of them jumped really far. I think it's probably all about desktop editing that a lot of these films have become really pretty damn visually interesting. Yeah. And that wasn't true.
I mean, even a movie like the Poltergeist remake, which I absolutely hated, the color tone of it is good. It has this something that horror has been able to pull off lately is just this menace with lighting.
Yes.
And that is just not in this film at all.
True.
I mean, it's just not a thing.
Well, I think that's obviously owing to the fact that this movie was made in 6 days. But the big question I have is, according to everything I could discover online, it was made for $20 million. Where did those $20 million go?
Tyler Perry's pockets, probably. I mean, maybe. I mean, he's like the production company for this stuff too. So.
Right, but he didn't need to pay himself. He would just make that money on the back end. So, I don't. It's just a genuinely confusing question for me. Like, okay, 6 days, no real names. Like, obviously, these YouTube stars, they could probably get some leverage out of their fame, but not like a Hollywood star could. So why did that 20 million not look like 20 million?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Because like The Witch, for instance, cost like, I don't know, what, 7 million or something like that?
So little.
And it looks great.
It's bafflingly beautiful.
And it has bigger stars.
Yeah.
Like, I would say the two people that are in Game of Thrones that are in The Witch, they're, I mean, I don't know, maybe Tyga is really expensive.
Right.
Like that couple minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's possible.
But then he wasn't even shot that well. So it was kind of like, okay, you had him in your movie, but you didn't, like, you got this amazing twerk artist.
Lexi Pantera. I'm in love with Lexi Pantera.
She's so ridiculous.
Her. Yeah, she's phenomenal in this film.
But, like, they don't even... Whoever did the cinematography for this film clearly doesn't know how to shoot hip-hop or dance, because it just made both Tyga's performance and Lexi's performance really kind of flat. I mean, compared to the rest of the film, it's like the action moments, but ultimately it didn't really deliver on their strengths.
Yeah, a lot of times when, like, especially hip-hop artists will be performing in a movie, think about Snoop Dogg in Old School, for instance, or P-Funk in the movie PCU. Like, that is a moment where oftentimes the cinematography of the film changes a little bit and it becomes more music video oriented,
right?
And that just doesn't happen here. I mean,
no, he got his start doing these plays, and then he ramped it up by documenting his plays, selling them on DVD at the shows, which is genius. And he made incredible money doing so, and he's still doing that. And that's fine. I mean, it's a formula that works for him. But consequently, he has this movie that looks like a sitcom. I mean, it looks like the Brady Bunch.
Yeah,
but
it's
clunkier.
like a 3-camera TV shot.
Exactly.
Thing.
The lighting is washed out and flat. But again, the comedy is so advanced.
Well, you know what this reminded me of? It reminded me of Kevin Smith movies. In a weird way, because the camera's not really moving. It's pretty stationary. It's very dialogue driven. There's a cast of characters that is what looks to be a bunch of friends, which is, I think, a very endearing thing about Kevin Smith. And a film podcast that I really like on YouTube is Double Toasted, and they did like a half-hour review of this film, and it was it's interesting because they're all black dudes except for one guy, and so they talk about the experience of like having family members bring them the DVDs and be like, oh my god, you gotta watch this, and like after church watching the videos, and basically about there's an audience that this was made for in the way that Kevin Smith is making his movies for a very specific
it's definitely
audience.
Like a FUBU thing for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and at that point, like, maybe, cinematography, who gives a shit? If you like watching Tyler Perry plays and that's fun for you. I mean, like, if you go back and watch the BBC Royal Shakespeare Company plays, they're not shot any better than this. I mean, they're basically the same thing, but in there you have, Anthony Hopkins and Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen putting on clinics on Shakespearean acting. I mean, they're phenomenal. So there's a little bit of the Silicon Valley, like, good enough to ship with this kind of thing. Right.
That's fair. I think something else this is just very much about me, but it was interesting for me to watch this film as I'm very involved in the drag culture in San Francisco, especially because my wife is Phonique, who will be doing a future episode with us. We're going to be covering Black Swan in about a month and a half with her as a guest. So, I've seen more drag shows than most people, and it was interesting for me to watch my first Madea movie because, Tyler Perry's not doing drag. It's a man in a dress, but it has no direct connection to queer culture or nightlife or cabaret life.
Right.
It doesn't seem to be in dialogue with drag culture at all, almost in the same way that like Dame Edna is not a drag character. And I think it's really really interesting to see someone come at the performance of a female, an exaggeration of femininity or female body with a cisgendered male body inside that character, and see what they do with it when they have incredibly different priorities than like San Francisco drag culture, which is very extreme in another direction.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, this reminds me of Mrs. Doubtfire.
Like that's another example. Totally.
And then specifically like in Mrs. Doubtfire, like he's not trying to represent women. He's created a character that just happens to be female. And in the South, like if you ever worked in a restaurant, you know what a Sunday post-church brunch shift is like. And you see this lady, this Madea lady, just like really funny. The kind of ethics of the character are really interesting to me too. Like clearly very churchy, but also carries a gun and a hammer in her purse. It is ready to use it. Another thing that I was very surprised by this movie about was how it treats drug use. Where it's very casual. There's the subplot of the aunt being really excited to show a cop that she has a weed card. Yeah. And there's a moment when the cops do come and they make a comment. They're like, "Oh, what's that smell?" And she breaks out her card, and that's it. There's no...
And the cop does not care.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also Joe is out of most of the movie because he's just sitting at home smoking a joint. Like, he's just out. He's just checked out of the movie because he's just, like, getting high in the armchair.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of, like, physical sexual comedy in the film, too. Like, there's a moment where...
For sure.
Yeah, like her boobs are like a constant source of like humor in the film, even to the point where she's like flashing frat boys and like showing them, and they're like totally repulsed and all this stuff. It's like a lot of like physical body humor that I guess it's still around in some films, but I mean, just the whole idea of just like making fun of people's physical features seems to have just fallen off of comedy. Like, it's just disallowed.
Yeah.
Now. But those were some, I mean, like, when they're making fun of the fat kid, that's probably the scene when I laughed the hardest, because it would, like, the whole thing when she's calling him Biggie Smalls and how he's going to shoot her and all that. I mean, it's pretty funny. I guess also problematic, to use the parlance of our times.
There's one thing that, I mean, I don't want to get hung up on, like, this wouldn't be continuity, but it sort of is, where the frat dudes, like, exaggeratedly lose their shit about the difference between a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old. Legally, rightfully so.
Yeah.
But it seems to actually be a core value that is such a given in this world that you don't mess around with someone under 18. But then they have no problem breaking and entering and vandalizing. And I don't know, like, sabotaging a car, I don't know what legally that is.
Oh, you could kill somebody.
That strikes me as attempted murder or something like that. Like, these are not, I mean, I know it's a comedy and all that, but like, to shoehorn in this don't mess around with 17-year-olds and then they go and like vandalize a car is a little inconsistent somehow.
Yeah.
About like one's like the morality that's at play, and the morality in this film is super heavy-handed when it's present. It's super not present around pot, but it's totally around the difference between 17 and 18, but it's not around vandalizing a moving vehicle.
Yeah, there's a lot of, anytime like the violence can be cartoonish, I think it gets like, I mean, because the whole like sabotaging the brakes thing is some Wile E. Coyote shit, really.
Yeah, sure.
You know, but one of the things I thought was funny about the whole consternation over the two girls being 17 is it is very rare, because the other girls, they're like, how old are you? And they're like 18. Like, okay, cool. Like,
exactly.
It just points out the absurdity of the line.
And they're like in their late 30s as people. Yeah. So it's extra weird.
It's super funny. But then I was reminded of the Neon Demon, where like literally every single character fails the test of, is it right to exploit this 14-year-old girl?
Right.
And in this film, everybody passes the test. You know, like there's not a single person who, you know, they're like, all illegals out. And so they mean like all the 17-year-old girls are like, get out of here.
Right.
And, you know, the frat guys are basically, I mean, I guess the villain. Although, if you're looking at it from the perspective of the girl, Tiffany, I mean, we talked about like Forrest Gump chasing down Jenny with Jason Voorhees like intensity. That's kind of what's going on here with Madea. Like, Madea is after her, and it's in a way that is vaguely Misery-esque. You know, like she just can't shake this older person with these weirder values in this ancient time. And that's another thing that happens in this film, is one of the tensions is generational. Or, you know, one of the major tensions, it's basically like, how did this older generation of people violently raise their kids? And then the proof is this character Brian, who's very successful. He was raised like that, but he's also powerless to raise his own daughter because he's chosen to go in a different direction. And so, I don't know. What do you think was the proper way to raise children?
Well, I don't know.
Kindly, or throwing them off the roof and letting a pencil go through their nuts, which is what happens.
Totally. I mean, and what I think is extra complicated about this within this film, anecdotally, is Tyler Perry. I mean, it's very much on the table. He was the victim of abuse from his father. And so the humor, which takes up a lot of screen time about child abuse.
I mean, that scene's like 20 minutes long of just conversation about how badly he abused how badly abused he was.
And how that's why he turned out so good.
Yeah.
And how they should beat Tiffany into submission. So Tyler Perry's really drawing from some really intense personal shit to make those scenes happen. But then it feels like it's only humor and that's wrong. But Tiffany doesn't turn around at the end in a sitcom wrapped up at the end of the half hour.
She's still awful.
Well, she's still awful, but she relents and acquiesces and at least gives lip service to being a better person, which in a sitcom is as good as she's a changed person. But she doesn't do it because of reason. She doesn't do it because they hit her. They threatened to throw her out on the street for real, which is a really interesting middle ground, but also pretty fucked up. Like throwing your kid out on the street is pretty hardcore.
Well, I mean, also, what do you think is going to happen to a hot 17-year-old girl that you put out on the street?
It's pretty real.
I mean, she's going to be doing
Madea.
some of that whole shit.
She's going to be Madea.
That's how you make a Madea. She gets out on the street and she's all hard and she's super mean. Okay, so there's horror elements of this film. There's zombies, there's ghosts, there's... Earlier you mentioned you weren't even sure that Tyler Perry maybe had even seen a horror movie.
No, Tyler Perry is not cult. He's he's like the interloper in my scene.
Yeah. I mean, the whole supernatural element is introduced by the girl. It's kind of her play is to play upon the superstitions of these older people and create this whole story about how there was a murder in the house, and every Halloween... I mean, this is one of the most absurd plot points. Is like, presumably they've been living in this house for a while, and this is the first Halloween that it's been an issue that there was a murder there. Yeah. And the safest thing to do is to split up and go into different rooms, like classic horror trope stuff. And then... Well,
what I love about, if I may, I love about that moment when Tiffany introduces that, it's probably like a Ouija board or something like that, and the death card falls out, is the graphic design of that board game that she brings out and the card.
Love and Death.
Yeah, is so weird. And that's something that... Another big example of weird graphic design in this movie is that on the wall in Tiffany's room, there's this framed poster... But it looks like an album cover, but it's rectilinear, and it says Progeny Crew, and it's like clip art of a dog. It's just the weirdest fucking thing. I don't know what it's supposed to be. Teen room walls are always this interesting lexicon into what this character's identity is according to the director and art directors, right? But in this, it's like Progeny Crew, a dog. And that's kind of all we get from Tiffany.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned the Ouija board game. I actually paused it because for a second I was like, is the word death, is it the same font from the Christian Death Only Theater Pain album cover?
I don't know why I wouldn't.
It's not,
but
it's very, very close. I mean, because I was looking at it.
That would have made Tyler Perry hella cult.
Yeah, he would have passed Key and Peele, like as far as being a pop culture, weirdo. But... the whole thing, when I was looking at it, it's like, it looks like a black metal album cover. It has like that kind of font treatment.
It's all wispy and
it's weirdly, I don't know. I mean, maybe just because like my eye catches that stuff. Probably most people who watched it were just like, what is this stupid shitty game or whatever. But for me, like that was definitely something I noticed.
Yep. Well, it looked interesting, but it didn't look like what that object should look like. Whatever comes in a cardboard box does not have that graphic design on it.
Yeah, and then I went and looked up like the Ouija board cover, and the Ouija board box shows people having fun playing. Like like every single game ever shows kids playing it on the cover. Like
right.
That is like communicating. Like,
well, have you been at San Francisco airport lately in the domestic wing? Because there's a huge, like they often have these exhibits of art and design. There's a huge Ouija board exhibition there.
Really?
It's incredible. It's epic.
Weird.
There must be like 100 different Ouija boards,
like from
and
different
their boxes,
cultures, or...
and well, I mean, it's pretty much all Western shit. It's not like First Nations people up in the far north of Canada had Ouija boards or something.
Yeah, I like Medea's response is like, I grew up in New Orleans. They got voodoo everywhere. Like she's just not playing the Ouija board game.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many funny, like, one-liners, like the uncle, he's like, I take y'all to the hotel if you hoes don't tell. Just all these funny little rhymes.
I think my favorite part of the movie is Joe's t-shirt. You can never see what it says because his belly always rolls it folded, but his t-shirt says wrinkles on fleek.
So good. I mean, that really kind of sums up what this movie's trying to do, too, is it's like trying to simultaneously appeal to like this older demographic and this younger, because I guess like Tyler Perry movies skew or older, like older folks tend to like them. But then you have Tyga, and they're like an obvious appeal to like younger. And you have Ask the Bro Professor, Dom Mazzaghetti, like he's one of the fraternity guys. His YouTube channel is hilarious. There's that long-haired dude who looks like he's like 40 years old.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the humor of Tyler Perry just ripping on these characters. I mean, I would love to see like the outtakes from this, like the stuff that was just too mean for the movie.
Well, another thing that's like that is if you rent a Tyler Perry DVD and then you watch all the previews, which is just like 5 Tyler Perry movie previews in a row, and so you just get punchline, all these Madea punchlines. It's really fucking fun.
Yeah.
I had a question.
Yeah.
So, in interviews for this movie, Tyler Perry doesn't talk much about it being a scary movie. He talks about creating a story that teaches. Mm-hmm. And what do you think of movies that are so obstinately teaching wholesome messages? Because I think obviously like I don't react to that sort of shit very well, and like probably most people, I only like being preached to if I already agree with what you're selling. Right. And wholesome is not something that sits too comfortably with me aesthetically. I love this movie anyway, I don't give a fuck. But how do you sort of deal with like wholesome messaging in your media? Well,
for me, I don't mind it at all.
Yeah.
But and for a little bit of a biographical detail is my wife and I were pretty much average financial messes, right? And we started listening to this dude, Dave Ramsey, who's an evangelical personal finance guy. And, we were in debt like a lot of people are, like credit card debt, owed on our cars, whatever. And he teaches this sort of like biblically based get out of debt because it makes you a better person, and there's a heavy moral component to it. And for whatever reason, we really respond, and we're not religious, we just really responded to this thing. And we, morality is essentially like put yourself in line with mass culture, put yourself in line with mainstream. And we kind of did financially, and our lives completely changed. So we downloaded basically through podcasts. We had this kind of like traditional morality related to money into our life, and you're not getting it from Hollywood. You know what I mean? You're not getting these lessons on how best to live your life. It's kind of like why like Stoic philosophy is so popular right now, and it continues. It's why so many people in Silicon Valley or in business read Marcus Aurelius and they don't fucking read Zizek. There's like, along with these moralities are also, ways to be successful and ways to live like a happier life. And I think one of the reason why these YouTube stars are so popular is like a lot of them are communicating ethics. A lot of them are communicating hacks and hustle and improving your life and self-improvement. And most movies don't really give you a foothold into how to live a better life. That was like the classic use of philosophy, was like how to comport yourself to have a better life. And I know like I'm supposed to be all super cynical, like heavy metal, goth girlfriend having dude, but I don't mind it at all. And because what you're getting with this movie. It's not like how often you go look at all the Oscar winners from last year. They're all fucking moralizing. They're teaching the gospel of the far left progressive.
Yes.
The rich Hollywood liberal elite. They're pushing their morality down your throat. This is just a different set of morality, and it feels unusual because you don't see it in Hollywood that often.
Fair.
Yeah, but I don't mind. I don't mind at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about? I mean, you obviously bristle to it with your dark aura.
Yeah, there's no room in my dark soul for so much light.
Yeah. But, like, the character Madea, I had always read that, like, everything ends in a praise Jesus in these movies. But she really... The church scene in this movie, she really only, like, agrees to become saved to escape zombies.
Yeah.
And there's all these moments where, she's talking to the preacher on the phone and she's, like, laughing about how she's, like, she goes, like, watch this. She goes, praise Jesus. And I'm going to make him preach harder. And it's just kind of funny where she's almost engaging. It's more cultural for her or for the character than it is moral. In a weird way.
Right.
Like, yeah. I mean, like, I didn't grow up in the black church environment, so some of this stuff probably isn't going to resonate with me the way it will other people. But there's a lot of, like, disrespect to Madea from, like, pretty famous black celebrities. Like Spike Lee, for instance, hates Tyler Perry's movies and thinks they're bad for society.
I think I enjoyed Boo a Madea Halloween more than I've enjoyed anything Spike Lee's done.
Definitely recently. I mean,
decades, I'll say for myself.
I mean, I love that movie Malcolm X. I think the first half of it is really shot beautifully. Like when it's about Harlem, and I think it's just an interesting movie. And like if I put a camera in Denzel Washington's face, and you're going to get something awesome no matter what. Really,
true.
But
except Training Day.
What?
We'll fight this one out later. That's a god-awful movie.
What? You're crazy.
It's his worst movie.
What? Oh, man, I don't know that you've ever been more wrong. Are you currently smoking PCP?
We're going to have to cover it for Scary Thoughts.
That is a highly ridiculous movie. But, I mean, you think about Training Day, like... I mean,
here we go.
Well, I mean, Training Day is it's a movie that's had enough cultural impact to be parodied on The Chappelle Show.
Right.
With the whole Wayne Brady Training Day montage.
Right.
And I guess it does kind of tie into this whole thing where it's like, okay, there's this demonstration of inner city tough guy, but it's pretty easily parodied at the same time because it's just this weird, like, action movie trope thing. And I don't know. I like Training Day. I'll go on record. Yeah.
Speaking of tropes, the next movie we're going to be covering is The Cabin in the Woods, which is the most intertextual, trope-laden movie ever, which is all about breaking the fourth wall. And my favorite fourth wall breaking thing of almost any movie, and it's really obvious but so funny in Boo, is when Joe says, if you don't come back, I just want y'all to know that's a dude.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing because
it comes out of nowhere, and it's kind of like turning to the camera and saying the most fucking obvious thing in the midst of this silly morality tale comedy. I thought it was genius.
Yeah, and just the line is delivered so, like, hilariously. Like, the comic timing of that character Joe is really, or I guess if Tyler Perry is really good, but that character in particular is pretty good.
And you know what? We're going to get into this in next episode in Cabin in the Woods, but Joe's been smoking weed, so he sees the truth.
He sees the truth, right? He sees through the bullshit, and the bullshit is that this is a man dressed up as a woman trying to get you to act morally, which is what Mrs. Doubtfire was. Remember? Yes. Like, it was like, it's I don't know, it's just weird.
I'm saying yes, but I've never seen Miss Doubtfire.
Really?
I just know what you mean. Yeah, I know. I will.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic San Francisco Robin Williams story, but no big deal. We live in San Francisco. It's like not a big deal at all. One of the things, I mean, this is touchy ground, and one of the criticisms of Tyler Perry's movie is like how movies, or Madea in particular, is there's this idea that there's a Hollywood conspiracy to emasculate black male actors by always demanding they wear dresses. And there's actually a Chappelle who's recently come under fire for some of his misogynistic comments in his new comedy special. But there's a story that Dave Chappelle tells Oprah.
Yes.
That's basically like, they wanted him to wear a dress for a scene, and it wasn't a scene that had been talked about, and he felt...
It was in a Martin Lawrence movie.
Yeah, it was a Martin Lawrence movie, and he felt that, like, it was kind of sprung on him. And the way he tells the story, I would probably agree. Like, it wasn't in the script. They were like, oh, we had this great idea for the scene, and you're going to wear a dress, and we're going to sneak out. And he's like, is there no other way that this movie could play this way? And he didn't want to wear this dress.
Which is fair.
Which is fair, right? And
if that's not his gender expression, that's his to decide.
But I think it goes, for him, it even goes beyond, like, gender expression,
Sure.
where it's a thing of, like, why is Hollywood so intent on putting black men into dresses? And on one level, like, if the role calls for it, it's written in the script, so what? It's just a funny gag or whatever. You can't imagine, you know, like, if Wesley Snipes is in To Wong Fu, it's a movie about drag queens, you're wearing a dress because that's what it is. So, but I think Chappelle's point was, like, why is this thing that wasn't a thing in here now? And then, I don't know how deep you go into Black Twitter, but there is, like, a huge amount of conspiracy theory around, like, the Illuminati of Hollywood demanding that people wear these dresses, and it's considered one of the stages of involving yourself with Satanism is to agree to cross-dress. And it which is just super, super weird. Like, you definitely go down a rabbit hole with this stuff. But, I mean,
it's amazing. But what frustrates me about the way that this topic... what it often implies, or overtly states, is that women are lesser than. Mm-hmm. That even the concept of emasculation is predicated on that someone is being reduced to womanhood.
You don't want to look like a bitch. Like, that's the classic statement. Like,
right.
You know?
And, you know, I mean, it just sort of reminds me of the Iggy Pop quote, where he says, I'm not ashamed to dress like a woman because I don't think it's shameful to be a woman.
Yeah, and I think that's super, super valid.
And so Dave Chappelle, he can wear whatever the fuck he wants, but it's problematic for him to somehow say that all these strong men are being forced to wear dresses. Right. Like, that's somehow not strong. Like, that's somehow lesser than. And I'm not saying this in somehow ignorant of the way that women are perceived in our world and how that actually does affect the stature of black men in our world and in Hollywood. But, you know, let's be honest, it's a double-edged sword. It's a problem in both directions.
But it's still pretty live. Like, I mean, look at this week, Jay Farrow, who's an actor, a black actor on Saturday Night Live, was let go or quit or fired, some combination of let go, quit, fired. And depending on what interview he's in, he discusses that he didn't want to wear dresses for scenes. And he thinks it gave him people had the opinion that he was difficult to work with or not a team player or something like that. And, you know, so apparently for a certain segment of these actors, they do not want to put on the dress because it's become a symbol. It's like one of those things where it's like, okay, I wonder if it's even beyond... At this point, is it even beyond gender? And it's more like, is this machine going to make me do something? And can I resist this machine?
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
But that's if you believe in...
Rage against that machine, Mr. Fair.
Yeah. I mean, who knows? I don't know. But it seems to be like these guys are making so much money. I mean, fuck, man. If I'm making Tyler Perry money, I'm throwing on a dress too. I don't give a shit. You know,
I'll share that dress with you. If I can have half.
Yeah. We just on record, Hollywood, Mark and I are willing to be a grotesque Siamese twin woman.
Well, you say grotesque, but I'm sure there's some fetish site out there that's just waiting for that to happen where there's even more money for us.
Yeah. Normally I wouldn't judge, but if you're into that, I judge you harshly. So, other than that, I don't have much else.
Scat. Twinsy drag. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Definitely someone somewhere has masturbated to Madea. There's for sure somebody who has that bizarre fetish.
And there's a lot of material.
The darkness of the internet.
I really don't know where to go from there.
Yeah, I think we've painted ourselves
Madea porn. Oh my god, I wish Chris Rock had made a joke about Madea porn, because then maybe that's what we would have gotten next.
I think that might have undone civilization. Like, that is the great old ones rising.
We will see you next time.
Speaking of great old ones
Speaking
rising.
of the old ones, for Cabin in the Woods. All right. Thanks for listening. Did we just end that?
I don't know. I don't know where we can go from here. So,
Quickly just roll the credits and fade to black.
if you're still with us, you're obviously the kind of person who likes this sort of shit. 5 stars on iTunes. Follow all of our stuff. It's the only way Mark and I will be able to escape this potential Siamese twin pornographic career that we have just invented for ourselves. Hopefully the secret is not real and that does not become our life.
Save us. Save yourselves.
5 stars only. Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
I think once you've talked about people masturbating to Madea, you've gone too far. I think I may have gone too far.